Welcome, everybody. So excited to have you in class today. My name is Carrie Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the National Constitution Center, and I'm here with one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly. Tom, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Tom and I are so excited because we get to talk to you all about the ratification process of the Constitution and some of the products that came out of that ratification, which are the Federalist Papers, as well as the Anti-Federalist Papers, both really, really important documents. So today we're going to walk you through, okay, what happens at the end of the Constitutional Convention on September 17, 1787. Last week, if you were with us for Constitution Day or any of the other classes, we led all the way up to that big important date. And now we're going to say what happens next. And this is fascinating, Tom. It's probably one of my favorite stories because it was one of those stories that, you know, you kind of glaze over pretty quickly when you're learning it. But when you dive deep into it, this is a big moment in time and a really, really, what do you always say? A really big battle that was on paper instead of on the battlefield. So we're excited to dive in. And Tom, you know, I always have 8 million questions, but I want to encourage the students, if you go through today and have questions or want to share, please feel free to use that chat. We love to hear your questions. And as we get started, we're going to talk about what is the ratification of the Constitution? How did it work, like logistically? And then also what happened during it? When did it happen and where did it happen? But then get into some of the details around the Federalists, Anti-Federalists, what came out of it, and who those people were, because it's always interesting to learn more about the people. So Tom, what would you like to dive into first? The big idea that comes out of ratification, or what does it mean in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, let's begin with the sort of what it means in the first place through the big idea. And so let's frame it, and then we'll go back to the convention. So, you know, ratification itself, I mean, this is a formal definition broader than the constitutional context, but it's the action of signing or giving formal consent to a treaty, contract, or agreement, making it officially valid. For purposes of the Constitution, this was really the idea that the Constitution itself, put together at the Constitutional Convention, was just a proposal by the delegates. Ultimately, they sent it back to the American people to say yes or no. That's the question of ratification. In the end, it was up to us, the American people, to decide whether this new Constitution was going to become the fundamental law of the land. And, you know, for us today, we look back and we say, we know how this story ends. You know, it may lack a certain amount of drama. Of course, we know the Federalists win. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they become famous, all of these sorts of things. But in context, it was a dramatic fight. It was really, really close. The Anti-Federalists, those who opposed the Constitution, almost won. And so we have big debates with the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution on one side, the Anti-Federalists, those who oppose the Constitution on the other side. And just with a few different votes shifting in key conventions in places like Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, the entire outcome could have changed. The American people could have said no, but instead, through this convention, these state ratifying conventions, state by state, they said yes. They said yes to this new Constitution.
And I think it's so amazing because it is such a big deal. I mean, even the act of ratification itself, that this Constitution isn't just signed by George Washington and the others and then written into the supreme law of the land, that it's given back to the people on September 17th, the people to read, the people to understand, and the people to decide upon. That's a huge idea and really kind of brings up this concept of going back to the people to get its power, to be energized by the people. So as we kind of think through this, Tom, how do we get from kind of wrapping up the convention to ratification? And it's written in the document, but is it just a smooth slide and then the battles start to happen? Or do the battles start to happen even before the end of the convention?
No, the battles begin at the convention itself, especially sort of heating up towards the end. Should we sort of fast forward there and then sort of follow the process through?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about Article 7 in the Constitution, that spells out how it's going to be ratified. But at the end of the convention, it's always my favorite story. Could you please tell us the story about somebody that was like, hold up, wait, we're not done yet?
Yeah, so I mean, let's place it in context. You know, the Constitutional Convention, it runs from May 1787 all the way to September 17th, 1787. That's Constitution Day, which we just celebrated last week. And just think about the process that these delegates to the convention just went through. There's an existing government in place, the Articles of Confederation. Many people who both support and oppose the new Constitution, still looked at the Articles of Confederation, this national framework of government, and saw that it was flawed. It needed changes. Even people who opposed the new Constitution still thought the Articles of Confederation didn't provide a strong enough government to create a great nation. And so at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates decide, one, we're going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. We want to get rid of them. And because of that, too, we're going to construct an entirely different framework of government. And so over these months, they have to build that government from scratch, creating three key branches of government: the legislative branch led by Congress making the laws, the executive branch led by a president enforcing the laws, and a judicial branch led by a Supreme Court tasked with interpreting the laws. And so through these months, there's bitter debates, bitter disagreement. They're grueling. It's this grueling period. It's hot. It's smelly. They're getting towards the end of the convention. They're filling in those final details. They think that they've actually achieved what they were looking for, a framework of government that they could all defend. And what happens? But George Mason from the great state of Virginia decides to stand up and say, delegates, excuse me. There's one big thing you're forgetting. Where is the Bill of Rights?
This story always makes me laugh because when you dig into Mason, he's like a bit of a curmudgeon. He talks a lot. Like, he's always like, by the way, I've got a lot of really good ideas. And they're exhausted. They're human and they're exhausted at the end of the convention. And he's like, wait, guys, we can do this and we can do it really quickly. And I think that's the thing that they probably all eyeball rolled, because Mason didn't do a lot of things quickly, but he maybe could have, because he had a few things in his pocket that he was thinking of when he said, don't worry, we can add a Bill of Rights really quickly.
Yeah, so I mean, Mason, he's a neighbor of George Washington. He's an important member of the founding generation himself. And his claim to fame is that he wrote the most famous state Bill of Rights. So even before we have the US Constitution, we have state constitutions in state after state. And in 1776, George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He writes it 3 weeks before the Declaration of Independence. So as Thomas Jefferson's writing the Declaration, he has Mason's Declaration right next to him, which lay out many of the cherished liberties we most care about, like free speech, et cetera, many things we'd ultimately see in our own Bill of Rights. And this Virginia Declaration of Rights would be, basically pulled from by other state constitutions that came afterwards, many of them basically cutting and pasting what Mason had done. And so as the delegates are getting ready for the end of the convention, Mason stands up and he says what Curry said, which is, by the way, we need a Bill of Rights. It's going to, he said, give, quote, great quiet to the people. His pitch is simple. He's like, I'm the Bill of Rights guy. I'm the Virginia Declaration of Rights guy. Give me a few hours, a few days. We can get this done. But the delegates say no. Not a single state supports George Mason's push. In the end, I think it's, we look back and say, this is crazy. How could you leave out a Bill of Rights? We Americans today look at the Bill of Rights and say, that's the heart of our Constitution. What's more important than that? But from the delegates' perspective, it's been a long summer. They want to see their families. They want to sleep in their own beds. They're tired and they want to go home. They think that they got the job done. They think that they put together a framework of government that the American people can get behind. And so they say, George Mason, no, we're not going along with you. Let's close out this convention.
And I think that's so important. And Jamie, thank you for sharing in the chat, Plain Honest Men by Rick Beeman. Great book by Rick Beeman. He actually helped build our museum. And it, absolutely so true. And he'll tell you, they are exhausted. They hear what Mason's saying, but they're not worried about it. And there were some people that said, I'm not worried about it because what we built is strong enough. So can you talk a little bit about, it's not just that they're exhausted, but that some of them believed that what they had was strong enough to protect those individual freedoms?
Yeah, so the supporters of the Constitution, as we get especially into the ratification debates, they have principled arguments for why we don't need a Bill of Rights. And so I think there are at least two really big ones that you see over time. One is the idea that for key Federalists, like you could especially say James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they really cared about constitutional structure. And so they were proud of this new Constitution. They thought through things like the separation of powers, so dividing power between the three branches of government, and then checks and balances, giving each of those branches a means of checking one another. that was really the way in which you protected rights. And so they thought that they limited the powers of the national government through that structure. And in that sense, Alexander Hamilton himself in Federalist 84 says the Constitution itself is a Bill of Rights, that structure of government is going to protect our liberties. The other is that James Madison, he spoke about this. James Wilson, another important Federalist, spoke about this. They were afraid that, once you start listing certain rights, two things are going to happen. One, we're not going to be able to list all the rights that the people have. The founding generation believed there were many natural rights that we held. And so if we list some but not others, we may think that the government has more power than we thought and that the people have fewer rights than are necessary. But even once you start writing out those rights in specific words, and Madison said this to his friend Thomas Jefferson, that you may not get them precisely right, that they might end up being narrower than they are actually out there in the world. And so there's a danger in writing them down.
That's so important. Thank you. And again, Plain Honest Men, we'll do a wrap up at the end of the week and share some of these resources and books too, so you can check them out. Now, we get to the end of the convention, and so many of our founding generation, so Washington, Hamilton, Madison, they signed the Constitution. They put their name on it to say, we believe in the document that we made and this big idea that's going to come out to you. But it wasn't Mason alone. There's others that kind of stand with him and say this Bill of Rights is missing, this idea of individual rights or the protection by the jury is missing. So can you talk a little bit about the dissenters, and then we'll roll into the heated battles that happened pretty much right after that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the convention, many of the delegates signed the Constitution, but 3 refused. And so it's George Mason, who we already spoke about, Massachusetts's Elbridge Gerry, and Virginia's Edmund Randolph. And so, there are the specific objection, one of them at least, is what George Mason says, which is we can't sign this thing because there's no Bill of Rights. That's certainly one of the key objections, but that's representative of a more general critique that they had of the Constitution. They saw that the Constitution is creating a new national government that had too much power, and that it was destined to really pull all political power to a distant national government, swallow up and destroy the states, and abuse the rights of the American people. And so we see here at the convention itself, with these dissenters, with some of the debates throughout the convention, the beginning of this battle over ratification. And Mason himself, and I'll end on this point, is that he's there on September 12th. He has his copy of the Constitution, and he's scribbling in the margins things that he objects to. This becomes Mason's famous objections to the Constitution. He would then send this to friends throughout the country. It'd be printed in pamphlet form. And George Mason's objections would then influence the debates that follow. His first objection in this pretty short document, that there's no Declaration of Rights in the Constitution.
Huge. Okay, so now it goes without their signatures. They stay in dissent. They stay in protest at the convention. It goes to the states for ratification. So one of our students asked, who's writing it and who is ratifying it? How open and how free are these state conventions at this time? Because we want to be really clear and transparent. The people who wrote the Constitution, even the guys who refused to sign it, they're all white male property owners. And so can you give us a sense of going to the states, who are we seeing that's ratifying it? Who are we seeing in this national, and one of our scholars once said, it's a national dialogue and discussion around what could be. And it is a really open dialogue, but could you give us a little bit more about that detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple things are noteworthy. One is it's not a single moment in time. It's a fairly long process. And so there's a reason why we're going to tick through state by state. There are certain debates that certainly extend to all of these states, but there are also peculiarities to the states themselves. Some are more challenging than others. The other is that in the context of the time, it's a very, very democratic debate. There's, robust articles, pamphlets, newspaper items, and everything else on both the Federalists, the supporters, and Anti-Federalist side in opposition. As they're creating these state ratifying conventions, state by state, the voters in those states have to decide who's going to sit in them, and they're voting for people specifically for the ratifying convention itself. So it's different than elections for things like the state legislature. And even in many cases, they open up the voting process to more people than they do in normal elections. So in many states, you'll see things like property requirements for people who are voting for members of the state legislature. Many states waived those. But at the same time, obviously the ratification process doesn't live up to the democratic ideals that we have today. plenty of people are excluded, everything from women to African Americans to some people who don't own property. The rules are different state by state. So on the one hand, it's a more democratic moment than we've seen in many ways in world history, but also compared to other elections that you'd have even for American state legislatures. On the other hand, it doesn't live up to our own expectations today.
And I think that's really helpful, Tom, because sometimes we just reflect back like it's today, or like it is one way or the other. So giving like a sense of framing that's helpful. Now, let's give some props and some cred to Delaware being the first state. So can you start taking us through how like this is like almost like a March Madness bracket, and you go through and you're watching the states, but there's some really interesting stuff going on at this time and debates that are heated, and it really sparks at that convention. And as Mason watches this kind of unfurl, he must be proud to say, like, see, I called it. I called where the issues were going to be, guys.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Now, a couple, just the preliminaries are that, one, you mentioned at the beginning, but I'll highlight it right now again, Curry, is that the Constitution itself sets out the rules of the game. So Article 7 of the Constitution says, how do we ratify this new Constitution? It's when 9 states say yes. And so we're sending it back to the American people. We're going to do it state by state. And when 9 states say yes, it's then ratified. What's amazing is go back and read, for instance, James Madison, and he's looking at this moment. And it's so exciting because he's saying, look, we had great people in this convention. We put together a great constitution. But right now, before ratification, it's just a piece of paper. It's no more than if I just scribbled it on my desk. In the end, we have to give it back to the American people. That's that key principle underlying all of American government known as popular sovereignty. That's ruled by we the people, not a king, not an elite, but us, the American people, because the delegates to the convention concluded that only the American people themselves acting through these state ratifying conventions can tear up the Articles of Confederation and put this new constitution in place. And so there's that big idea that it's a proposal. The Constitution's a proposal of the Constitutional Convention, and it only becomes a true fundamental law when the American people choose to ratify it, when the American people choose to say yes through their ratifying conventions. And so we see, again, coming out of the convention, this debate breaking out between the Federalists on the one side, who are supporters of the Constitution, Anti-Federalists on the other side, saying, no, we don't want the new Constitution. There are heavyweights on both sides. And so, on the Federalist side, at the convention, you have the 2 most famous Americans, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. This tells the American people something big's happening in Philadelphia. Something big happening here. You have to take it seriously. But there are other big, important figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, who are pretty famous today. But people like John Dickinson, James Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris, who are very famous and important in their own day. So there's heavyweights on the Federalist side. What they're fighting for above all is that they want a national government that's more powerful than the framework of government created by the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers. But they wanted a national government that was powerful enough to address genuinely national concerns. So that's the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, so sometimes we give them short shrift, but these are really important figures too. They had their own political heavyweights there. Virginia, they had George Mason. They had Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, important revolutionary. They had Richard Henry Lee. In Massachusetts, they had Samuel Adams of the Boston Tea Party, Elbridge Gerry, one of the dissenters at the Constitutional Convention, and the key constitutional thinker and historian, Mercy Otis Warren. And New York's own powerful governor, George Clinton, also opposed the Constitution. Generally speaking, the Anti-Federalists tended to be more likely to be small farmers than lawyers or merchants. So the Anti-Federalists, more small farmers, the Federalists, more lawyers and merchants. And then Anti-Federalist support was stronger in the western parts of states rather than the eastern part, in rural areas rather than the cities, and also in larger states rather than smaller states. And what were the Anti-Federalists arguing? Above all, it was really a question of political power and where to place it. It was a question of federalism. How much power goes to the national government? How much to the states? Well, the Federalists said we want a stronger national government. The Anti-Federalists argued, no. We need most power to be lodged in the states. They were on the side of state and local power above the powers of the national government. So I just want to put that frame before now we get into the state by state, Curry.
And I think it's really, really important. So just for clarification for our students, the Federalists are going for pro-ratification. They're going for pro-document. They're pushing that agenda forward, that goal forward to get it ratified by the 9 states that they needed. And the Anti-Federalists are people that are saying, whoa, wait a minute here. We might have a problem with this. And here's how we're going to start to lift this. Now, before we kind of go into how it starts ticking through, the Federalists, like, not that they have it, not that this wasn't hard, not that this wasn't a huge battle, but they've got a lot on their side because they walk into this battle knowing that the articles were not working, that our country is in a big mess right now, and they've got a solution. So that's got to give them a lot of power right there, just as they begin this struggle.
Absolutely. And the other thing to remember, and it's so easy to forget today, is that when this new Constitution comes out, the American people themselves are really surprised. You have to remember the delegates in Philadelphia, they met in secret. When they were sent there by Congress, Congress said, we know there's problems with the Articles of Confederation, try to make them a bit better. But the delegates almost immediately say, no, we're going to come up with a new framework of government. And so as this thing comes out after the Constitutional Convention, the American people are surprised, and they have to read this new Constitution and figure out, what do we think? Are the Federalists going too far? We know there are problems with the Articles of Confederation, but is it really okay to just tear them up and start something new? And so this is the big debate that happens state by state, whether to say yes or no to this surprising new, in many ways, innovative document.
And that's why I think what scholars talk about, everybody was talking about it. They're talking about it. They're reading the document as it comes out 2 days later in the Pennsylvania packet and goes out with all of their delegates. But it's not just the state convention and the people at the state convention. People are talking about it in their churches. They're talking about it in their, bars or taverns. I guess that's the appropriate word, taverns. And they're having dialogues around it. So it is a national dialogue and discussion. And then the papers, the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers really do kind of, at least in certain areas, kind of charge that discussion. So kind of walk us through state by state, what's going on in each state, and then what are some of the key states where the battles became innovative changes to the document.
Yeah, and so what you can see from here, the early ratifications, it's really that first month of conventions. There's some big victories for the Federalists. They win 5 states and they win them pretty quickly. The first state to ratify is Delaware, and it's unanimous, and that's on December 7th, 1787. But they also win fairly quick victories in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. New Jersey and Georgia in December and January are both unanimous. Pennsylvania, you see, ends up being 46-23. It's a bitter fight, but the Federalists win. It's a big, important state. It's an important early victory. And Connecticut ratifies in January 1788, 128-40. So you see here, Curry, one interesting thing is you see some small states are early ratifiers. And part of that is, they see value in the Union because they're small, and by holding together, they can help protect the residents of those states. They also thought that they got a pretty good deal in the new Constitution because the new Senate, the United States Senate, has equal state voting. And so whether a state's big or small, every state has the same amount of political power in that one body. So they thought they got a pretty good deal.
So one question I had for you is, when we look at Georgia, we look at like the deeper South, is there a part of that early vote that comes in because of the compromises that gave them favor towards keeping enslaved people?
Well, certainly the Federalists from Georgia and South Carolina made that argument at the ratifying conventions. They thought that the compromises over slavery protected the slaveholding interests well. I mean, for a state like Georgia, too, it's really on the frontier and very small. So part of it, too, also was national security. So it was sort of a combination of those two things.
Yeah, I just remember those speeches that were given, and I wanted to kind of say, like, these are all these factors that are playing into why some states move quicker. Now, Massachusetts is a big win that they finally get, but it's not an easy win. And again, some of the big players that we know from the Declaration are in this story about what was happening in Massachusetts, and then moving them forward changes a lot for other states.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's these 5 early ratifications, and then there's a big fight in Massachusetts. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are closely divided in the convention itself. Some of the biggest figures in Massachusetts are critical of the Constitution. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, the heroes of the American Revolution. They are skeptical of this new Constitution. And so the Anti-Federalists really push hard in the Massachusetts State Convention, and they say, if we're going to ratify this new Constitution, first you have to promise us that you're going to change it in ways that we'd like. You have to promise us that you're going to amend the Constitution. And the Federalists fight hard. They fight hard to try to tell the Anti-Federalists, you got to take it or leave it. Yes or no, no amendments. But they end up deadlocking in the Massachusetts Convention. And ultimately, the Federalists come together with Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and they come up with what we refer to as the Massachusetts compromise. And so what the Massachusetts Convention agrees to do is it says it will ratify the new Constitution, but that the Massachusetts Convention then has to recommend to the new Congress when it sits that you have to amend the Constitution in certain ways. And so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists hammer out a set of recommended amendments that they send along to Congress that they hope that Congress will take up if and when the new Constitution is ratified. So on February 6, 1788, the Massachusetts Convention votes in favor of ratification, but even then the vote's close, Curry. It's 187 to 168. So it's still a very close vote between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but Massachusetts ratifies. And this becomes a model then that the Federalists follow in the remaining conventions where Anti-Federalist support is relatively high.
And this is where, sorry, I'm just making sure everybody can see the stats there. This is where I always think Mason must have felt really good because he's like, this is what I was telling you guys. We wouldn't have gotten here. But really, really important because it sets this idea of, a ratification of a document is a contract. So the people are saying, okay, we agree to this contract, but here's our terms and stipulations. This is what we're adding to this contract. And that really kind of amplifies this need and want for a Bill of Rights. Now, take us through the last few states to get us over to the win. And then there's a couple good questions to lead us into the Anti-Federalists from the Q&A. So great job on questions, people.
Okay, that's perfect. So now the remaining states, they draw on this Massachusetts Compromise. And so we see battles in state after state. The next series of states that ratify, there's Maryland in April 1788, South Carolina in May 1788. And then on June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire ratifies. And this is the key moment where New Hampshire is the 9th state to ratify again, June 21st, 1788. So under Article 7 of the new Constitution, the Constitution is ratified. The American people said yes, but for the Federalists, the work is far from done. For them, there are at least two really, really big and important states that haven't said yes yet. That's Virginia. That's New York. Both of these states have strong anti-Federalist support. The Virginia Convention is pretty closely divided between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. New York actually is lopsided, and the Anti-Federalists won a big majority in that state ratifying convention. And so the Federalists have to work with one another and then try to compromise with the Anti-Federalists to secure ratification in Virginia and New York. These are really close fights, but finally in June 1788, Virginia ratifies, but again, a close vote. They win by 10 votes, the Federalists do, 89 to 79. And then in New York, it's a razor-thin margin of 30 to 27, another bitterly close contest, July 26, 1788, but the Federalists win. Now, again, to emphasize how it's crazy that it's that close, think of who the Federalists are in that New York convention. It's Alexander Hamilton. It's John Jay. I mean, there's such heavy hitters. It ends up being close. But those are the first 11 states to ratify. North Carolina and Rhode Island actually wouldn't ratify until the new government's in place. So we wouldn't even have all 13 of the original states there in the Constitution. But that's a bit of the timeline there, Curry.
Yeah, and real quick, that was Joe's question in the Q&A. What was the deal with Rhode Island wasn't set from the beginning, let's just be honest. But what was the biggest concern with those two states?
I mean, it still is. So Rhode Island didn't even send delegates to the convention. They were malcontents in many different ways. But actually, Rhode Island, there was very strong anti-slavery support. So in that case, those anti-slavery voices didn't like the compromises in the Constitution. So that in part was animating Rhode Island. North Carolina, it was more sort of a combination of the anti-Federalist arguments that we'll get into in a little bit. They just weren't ready quite to ratify the new Constitution. They were concerned about the new Constitution creating a large national government, national government that was too powerful. And so they didn't quite want to join yet.
Fascinating. Now, great question, Joe. One of our attendees in the Q&A also asked, was it really like polarized? Was it like, I'm a Federalist, I'm an Anti-Federalist? Or was it more of kind of like a spectrum between the two?
So, yeah, I mean, it was more complicated than it just being Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And I mean, it's important to remember, even the supporters of the Constitution, there were parts of the Constitution they didn't like either. I mean, you could just go back to the notes of the convention and you could see the various things that James Madison lost on Alexander Hamilton lost on, but ultimately they concluded the new Constitution was worth defending and was better than the Articles of Confederation. Similarly, within the Anti-Federalists, there were a range of views of really anti-Federalists, like Patrick Henry, who just really didn't like this idea of a new, strong national government. But there were others that were more open to, if you can amend in certain ways, we'll go along with this new Constitution. And that's very much Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, some of those even Mason, the Anti-Federalists we talked about at the beginning, they were somewhat softer in their opposition than others like Patrick Henry. So it varied.
Two more real quick questions. One, Emily wanted to clarify, when they voted, was it just yes or no, or could they abstain? Could they, like, I don't like it, I'm going to abstain, but were they forced to make a choice in the convention?
Well, they could still abstain or leave, but I mean, it is important, and it's important. And many anti-federalists complained that it was ultimately, though, for those who were going to vote yes or no to the Constitution, they didn't vote on provision by provision, section by section. Instead, they had to take it or leave it based on yes or no, and in the end, could recommend amendments. But it was ultimately up to Congress and the American people to decide whether or not to ratify those recommended amendments after the Constitution was in place.
Awesome. I think I got most of them in. Real quickly, is the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers come out of this debate. And Warren asked about why was New York so heated? And that's a great way to get us into the Federalist Papers that were happening in New York. And it was really heated. So why is it so heated? And then can you walk us through some of the big reads that we have on everybody's homework list this weekend, if they haven't already read them?
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing, these reads aren't too long, so you could definitely pick them up. So New York ends up, everyone knows there's going to be a big showdown in New York. In part, it's because the anti-federalist support was so strong. The governor of New York, George Clinton, was very powerful. He opposed the new Constitution. New York itself, two of its delegates to the Constitutional Convention, Robert Yates and John Lansing, walked out of the convention. And so for much of the convention, New York wasn't even represented there. There wasn't a quorum in place. And so everyone knew that New York was going to be a difficult spot. And therefore, it's no accident that the key writings we're going to focus on today and sort of tick through are, on the one hand, Brutus, who is the key anti-federalist voice. He wrote his essays, largely his audience was New York. Scholars still debate who Brutus was, but we think it's Robert Yates, one of those New York delegates who walked out of the convention. And so he advanced all of these important anti-federalist arguments, effectively boiling down to what we've emphasized already, which is a concern that the new national government's going to be too powerful, that the Constitution itself grants kind of open-ended powers to the national government. And over time, the elites in power are going to seize more and more power away from the states, bring it towards a government that's distant from the American people, that's distant, that's sort of out of touch with their concerns, and that ultimately is going to fail and lead to abuses of government. And so there's Brutus really expressing this vision of an American Constitution that instead should commit to state and local power, the government that is closest to the people. And so that's Brutus. So Brutus advances these arguments. There's a lot more there. Please take a look. Brutus essay number 1 is the one you really want to start with, because it boils down a lot of these arguments. But when the Federalist Papers are put together, we think of them as high political theory today, but they were political documents. They were meant to persuade largely audiences in New York to say, where there's a lot of skepticism, to say it's time to get on board and support this new Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, in many ways, is the ringleader. He's from New York. He's also read Brutus. And he said, boy, these arguments are pretty good. We need to respond to these arguments. And so the Federalist Papers are a collection of 85 essays authored by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. They write collectively under the pen name Publius. And just to tick off 2 important ones that responded to Brutus, let's look at 2 quickly from James Madison, Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51. Read them in whole. They're not that long. In Federalist 10, Madison's dealing with what he calls the problem of faction. And so faction is just, it's kind of a word we don't use as often anymore. But what his idea here is that one big concern in our government is that there's going to be factions. Factions, for him, were groups that were committed to more passion than reason, more to private self-interest than to the public interest. And so his concern was that factions may come together, they may ignore the public good, serve their own self-interest, and oppress the rights of people who are in the minority. And so for Madison, he thought the new Constitution and this new union was so important because in small states, in local governments, it's easy for factions to combine together and oppress everyone else. But in a big union, in a big nation, we're going to have so many more interests and factions available that it's going to be harder for people to unite together and oppress minority rights. And furthermore, if we want big things to happen, it's going to require people who think differently to come together around ideas that genuinely serve the common good. So that's Federalist 10. Federalist 51 then deals with the principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. So what James Madison says here is, Brutus, I hear you. We are concerned about this new national government having too much power. We are concerned about elites that are out of touch. We are concerned about elites grasping for power. Madison knew that human nature was flawed. And so what he said is, in the end, we have the answer for you, Brutus and Anti-Federalists. It's in the structure of our government itself. What we've done is we've taken power from the people. The people have then divided that power into three branches of government: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. By dividing power, we make it harder for the national government to abuse everyone else. And furthermore, we've given each of those branches of government the power to check the other one. And so Congress may have the power to pass laws, but the president has the power to veto the law, and the federal courts have the power to say whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. So this is meant to limit the powers of the national government, but it's also meant to do something constructive, Curry. It's meant to build a certain politics in our country that ends up making it hard to achieve big things, but also permit the national government to serve the national interests and the public good. And so the idea is that for anything to become a national policy, that it's going to have to run this gauntlet that Madison talks about in Federalist 51. You're going to have to get Congress to pass this law. You're going to have to convince the president that it's a good idea. And you're going to have to convince the federal courts that it's constitutional. And the idea here is that we want the system to be complicated. We want the constitutional system to slow politics down, to promote deliberation, to promote debate, to promote reason, public reason. And in the end, to take any ideas that come in, toss out the bad ones, take the flawed ones, make them better, take the great ones and make them national policy. And that's the big theory of government that you find throughout the Federalist Papers.
And I love that. I love this idea that, and we see it in 51. So as you're reading it, these are the quotes that everybody kind of pulls out from that. But Tom, the way you break that down is so successful. That is why we engage in civil discourse and dialogue. We engage in this to make sure we're cleaning out what doesn't work and building up what should be there and what is great. So in Federalist 51, you'll also see ambition must be made to counter ambition. To take people's nature and use it for good. I love that line in that. And then the other line that we hear Lincoln and others pull in is, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So don't trust people either. Put in structure to ensure that this process happens. So I love those pieces. I love the idea that Madison coined trust the process way before Phillies coined it. So it's awesome. Again, that is the only sports analogy you will really hear from me in one class. But thank you so much, Tom, for walking us through all these ideas, all these great readings. And students, remember, we're going to send out a document at the end of the week that has links to all these. So if you haven't read them, join in and read them. We also have some shares in the chat about the musical 1776, so feel free to read that as well. But Tom, I wanted to thank you so much. Students, I wanted to thank you as well. We're going to stop right now, but we will stay online with you. So if you have follow-up questions, because I see a few in there, we can get to those also. So thanks, Tom.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.